The ambition of blockchain is still just quite small, right? Until we get 4 or 5 networks that are all trying to push 10 million transactions per second or more, the needs of today can be met by the supply of today. People forget that Facebook literally wired up the entire Philippines with subsea cables so they could sell ads to people there. At some point, all sufficiently large enough software companies have to start looking at hardware, or else they realize their ambitions simply cannot be met. And we're trying to accelerate that process by a decade for the blockchain industry.
This episode is brought to you by Chaos Labs, one of the leading on-chain risk management firms. You'll be hearing more from them later in the show. This episode is brought to you by Ledger, the most secure hardware wallet trusted by 7 million users and securing 20% of the world's digital assets. We'll be hearing more from them later in the show. Thanks to Renaud Partners for sponsoring this episode. Renaud Partners is the premier go-to-market consulting firm for early-stage Solana teams. They've been deeply involved in the community since 2021, supporting some of the best-known projects in the ecosystem. Thanks again to Renaud Partners for making this episode possible. Hey, Lightspeed listeners, we need your help. Lightspeed is conducting an audience survey to help us get a better picture of who our listeners are and what you want to see from the show. Think of this as our annual review. What do you like about the show? What could we improve on? If you want to contribute, visit the link in our show notes to fill out the survey and help us make a better show for you. Hey everyone, today we had on Austin Federa, formerly head of strategy at the Solana Foundation, now the co-founder of something called DoubleZero. When Austin announced that he was founding DoubleZero last week, it got a good bit of attention, partly because Austin is a notable public figure for Solana, but also because it's a really ambitious startup. It bills itself as a new internet for modern distributed systems. We chat through a lot on this episode, including how the modern public internet works, which I found really fascinating, what a new internet could look like, and what Austin's departure means for the Solana Foundation. I hope you all enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Lightspeed podcast. I'm your host, Jack Kubanek, alongside Mert Mumtaz, and we're very excited today to be joined by new co-founder of DoubleZero, Austin Federa. Austin, thanks for coming on the pod.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this is really a meeting of giants here because not only are you starting a new internet or whatever, but you're also the host of the Validated podcast, which I was doing some digging and it looks like you're taking that from the Solana Foundation where you are wrapping things up to DoubleZero. So I'm curious what the negotiations were to get you to be able to keep the pod.
Yeah, they were gracious enough to let me take it with me in moving on from the Solana Foundation. But, I've spent the last 4 years working on the Solana project. And one of the big things for, going on and doing a next step and a next thing was to do something that was not competitive with Solana. I think there's a lot of folks who have either left foundations and they go and they work for a different foundation, or they end up competing with them in some way. And I think for me, the ambition of this industry is still so small that I would rather work on something that is sort of a base layer booster for all fast networks, as opposed to something that is, competing with Solana or just working on Solana itself.
Okay, that makes sense. And so fear not, listeners, Validated is still coming out with, you do really good kind of technical episodes. I saw you just did one with Renaud. So I want to get into DoubleZero. I think that's what a lot of listeners will be interested in. Really excited to get you on the show so soon after you kind of announced it. It's a really interesting project. I think I want to kind of just dive into all facets here, but DoubleZero is really built, I think, on the premise that the bottleneck for blockchains is not the hardware that is running the blockchain software. It's how information can get between this hardware. So maybe just to set the table for this discussion, can you explain to me, or sort of to a high schooler, how does information get passed through the internet, and what are the inefficiencies and bottlenecks as that exists right now?
Yeah, definitely. So first off, apologies. I came back a little sick. So if you hear a little bit of that's what that is. So Today when we look at the global internet, it is a marvel of technology and invention. And it's designed to create peering relationships where you can get from any one device to any other device anywhere in the world in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable amount of performance. And that is not worth glossing over. That is like fundamentally like the fabric of the open internet that we know and love today. And that is an incredible system and for what it does. What it's not good at is doing things quickly or doing things efficiently. Now, quickly is in the eye of the beholder, right? You send an iMessage and it basically instantly appears somewhere else in the world, but those are not time sensitive, highly competitive environments. Those are environments where what you're doing is just trying to get a packet in a reasonably fast period of time from one place to another. And so the systems that govern this are called least cost routing, which basically means every time there's two options on a path a packet could take, as long as it's not going literally backwards, it's going to take the cheaper one. And so you can see this if you actually like trace route a packet. There's some like basically advanced trace routing, like my trace route's one of these tools, and you can ping like a server in, let's say, Tokyo from the United States. What you'll see is like if you ping from New York, your packet's not going like, oh, it's going from New York to Tokyo. Boom, we're done. It is going to Philly, and then it's bouncing up to Chicago, then it's bouncing down to Atlanta, and then it's going over to Dallas, and then it's going over to Denver, and then it's going back to Boston. Like these packets move all around the world in crazy routes that don't make any sense to any human, except when you look at the cost of the routing path, right? Because at the end of the day, we sort of like to think that we invented this congestion problem on Solana. But like packet congestion is like as old as the internet, right? Different pathways have different fixed amount of bandwidth available to them. And you can't push more bandwidth over a packet or over a channel than the channel supports. So you start dropping packets. And so the beauty of the internet is you don't actually get packets dropped that often. You make it really indeterminate experiences. So there's a metric called jitter, and jitter is basically the variance in time it takes a packet to get somewhere. So if I ping from my house to your house constantly, it might take 45 milliseconds the first time, 75 milliseconds the second time, 35 milliseconds the third time, because each time the packet is being routed over a different path in real time. This is fine for a lot of applications, right? BitTorrent is famously built for out of order packet delivery, right? You can download part of a file at different orders depending on what people have available at any given moment. This doesn't work very well for high frequency trading, right? This is why all financial service companies run their own networks. This barely works for something like YouTube, which is why what happens nowadays is there's a whole sort of dark fiber system, not dark fiber, but this whole private fiber system that gets files all around the world. And then you're doing last mile delivery over the public internet. Today on blockchains, everything runs through the public internet. So if you are a validator in Tokyo building a block, you are receiving packets from Mert and others all over around the world, and they're all rushing to get to your validator in Tokyo as quickly as possible. Now, if you're sending a packet from New York, it might take 220 milliseconds to get there. It might take 380 milliseconds to get there. If it takes 380 milliseconds to get there, you've almost certainly missed the leader at that point, right? And so what we sort of set out to do with DoubleZero is to say, this is a solved problem in like the corporate world, right? Private networking has existed for 30 years. This is nothing new. But what's new is that it's never been possible to do this without having one centralized entity run it. So we sent out to take sort of the best of the traditional, private networking world and apply blockchain principles to it and see if we could build credibly neutral base layer infrastructure that also provides censorship resistance and decentralization.
So perhaps to reframe this for the audience in case they miss anything, there's the internet. The internet is just some cables, and you send packets, information, data, zeros and ones, and it kind of goes all over the place, and sometimes optimizing for cost as opposed to latency. And obviously we like reducing latency and increasing bandwidth. And with DoubleZero, it seems like we're hinting at potentially leveraging some of these private networks that are a bit more optimized or much more optimized for latency. And so if we go further along that train of thought for a second, what exactly does DoubleZero do that's new as opposed to the existing internet?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things. So first, let's start with like the performance side, because that's kind of like the sexiest side of it. Um, Dedicated bandwidth means it's always available. This is sort of the difference between like calling an Uber and having like a private driver. Like, the guy's always outside waiting for you versus like you can probably get an Uber, but like it might be 4 minutes, it might be 12 minutes, it might be $20, it might be $80, right? There's a lot of variance that goes into that sort of experience. And so with dedicated bandwidth, like a network like Solana or pretty much any blockchain, they're very predictable. If you have 3% of the stake on the Coinbase validator or the Helios validator, you pretty much can predict exactly how much data and how much connectivity that validator is going to need. It is more than a validator running 0.1% of stake because it's building 3% of the blocks as opposed to 0.1% of the blocks. So these are actually like fairly predictable bandwidth usages and network connectivity characteristics. And so we can build routing tables, which are basically just paths that packets take, designed around how networks are actually deployed. And a network like Solana, it actually doesn't change that often, right? Like we have epoch boundaries of every 3 days, approximately. There's a lot of work that goes into that where you can look at this, or a computer can look at this and say, this is actually a fairly not exactly simple, but very easy to model routing problem, which is very different than something like, Fortnite, where there's 2 million players at any given moment and, they're popping on and off at random. And so the routing problems there are a lot harder to think through. So from a performance standpoint, we can do two things. The first is we can provide much fatter bandwidth pipes, right? Right now, most validators on Solana have anywhere between, 1 to 5 gigabits of connectivity. Some of the heavier ones have 10. I'm not sure what the RPC stack runs nowadays. That's like its whole other can of worms where there's a ton more system requirements over there. But on DoubleZero, what we're doing is a few different components that'll reduce the amount of bandwidth that a validator needs, but also increase the amount of bandwidth available for state. We can get into kind of how all these different components work. But the other one is DoubleZero should provide a time-consistent experience. Like Helios should be able to know if my RPC is located here on the DoubleZero network and the validator I'm trying to talk to is here in the DoubleZero network, it will always take approximately the same amount of time for my packets to get there. And so that means from an RPC provider, you don't have to play this guessing game of, is it going to take 200 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds for my packet to get there? You can know that like, hey, this path that my packet is going to flow, I can look at this public routing table. I can assess what everyone says their latency and jitter numbers are. And I can say, it'll be 237 milliseconds within 1 or 2% of variance always to get there. And suddenly that means that the tools that are available to RPC operators, to Jito, to all these people who are trying to land high value transactions that are very time sensitive, they won't have to play this guessing game that they have to play with the public internet. The other component that goes into this from a performance standpoint is we can start raising limits on the Solana protocol. Right? Like if anyone was at Breakpoint this year, you saw a demo of the FireDancer client running 1 million transactions per second. I think it was 1.06 million transactions per second. That was running over the DoubleZero network. That was running on 6 nodes globally distributed over what is now called the DoubleZero network. Back then, it was just a private demo example network, so we weren't quite ready to announce everything. But those are the type of situations. 1 million TPS day one, probably not, but we're really designed to remove the base layer bottlenecks and allow the protocol engineers at Anza, at FireDancer, at Foundation, at Jito, at other places all around the ecosystem to say, we don't have to worry about this base layer connectivity constraint anymore. We've solved that problem the same way that, compute has been solved on most networks as well. We can start pushing the bounds of these systems, start raising limits, and start getting closer to 1 million transactions per second.
Chaos Labs, the leading on-chain risk management firm, recently launched its new flagship Oracle product, Edge, which delivers integrated, high-precision risk and price data for any on-chain application with a market. Edge emerged from stealth after 2 months securing Jupiter, the top swap platform on Solana, already securing $30 billion in volume and more than 60% of all Solana perps volume. Edge is comprised of 3 components: price, risk, and proofs. It delivers high-precision price data with an integrated risk engine powered by Chaos's advanced outlier and anomaly detection algorithm, It automates delivery of real-time parameter adjustments on-chain based on current market conditions, and it enables the secure on-chain delivery of custom data points, including reserve attestations delivered via ZKPs. Most recently, Wintermute announced its selection of the Edge Proofs Oracle for Outcome Market, its new smart contract-based election prediction market tool. Thank you to Chaos Labs for making this episode possible. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger remains the most secure hardware wallet for your Solana and logins, trusted by 7 million users and securing 20% of the world's digital assets. In recent years, Ledger has built a robust ecosystem of products and services, making digital ownership more secure and accessible to everyone. Ledger's newest devices, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex, feature the world's first secure touchscreens, making it easier and safer to manage your Solana transactions and coins. With Ledger Live, you can seamlessly and securely manage and stake your SOL. Alongside Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex, Ledger introduced the Ledger Security Key app, a safer alternative to traditional passwords, enhancing your overall digital security. During the holiday season, upgrade to Ledger Flex and get $70 in Bitcoin. Hurry, because this offer is only valid until December 23rd while supplies last. Everybody knows there's a massive shortage of top senior marketers in crypto, and teams are constantly struggling to get their go-to-market done right. Renaud Partners is the premier go-to-market advisory firm for early-stage crypto teams. They help top founders tell their stories better and build great non-technical teams. They advise founders on all things marketing, tight brand positioning, community building, social media, and building A+ internal teams. They work with some of the top projects across Solana, Monad, Ton, Base, and others. Renaud Partners has built the most elite network of native crypto marketers globally. They create custom expert teams to support founders with transformative strategy work. Some of the best founders, VC firms, and ecosystem leaders in the business trust Renaud Partners to help their teams expedite their marketing success and catalyze their growth. If you're a founder or a VC looking for support for your teams, I highly recommend connecting with them. You can learn more at renaudpartners.com.
So if I understand correctly, the way to achieve better routing, let's say, is going to be with DoubleZero, tighter service level agreements between bandwidth providers and where the packets actually route, because the blockchain is inherently more predictable than something like a Fortnite game. But also you're just going to make the pipes bigger and wider, and so the more data can flow. There is another aspect which DoubleZero enables around FPGAs and edge filtering and things like that. And I want to get to that. But perhaps before we get to that, one of the interesting things, so I was talking to Matteo, who's also part of the DoubleZero founding team. The one thing that he said that was interesting was how centralized the internet is, which is to say, tier one service providers, there's roughly, was it 19 something along those lines that control the entire internet with peering agreements. And this is something that's quite ambitious, but which DoubleZero could take on. How do you guys ensure a more decentralized internet layer?
Yeah, it's something people don't think about much. Like if you look at from we spent a lot of time, or we used to spend a lot of time before centralized sequencers came out, on Nakamoto coefficients, right? How many entities have to collude or be censored in order to stop you from transacting on a blockchain? And we always look at the compute layer, right? It's always like, oh, how much stake is here? How many people are running nodes, right? And that's a super valuable lens of analysis. But on the network level, things are way more centralized, right? The Ethereum Nakamoto coefficient from a networking standpoint is something like 4. On Solana, it's basically 2. And so that means that like if TerraSwitch decided to kick all the Solana validators out with no notice or block all traffic, that would be a problem, right? If AWS decided to do this, that would be a huge problem for Ethereum. Now, neither of those things are likely scenarios, but blockchain is not an area where we just brush unlikely scenarios under the carpet. We think deeply about these types of structural problems. And so the idea with DoubleZero is very counterintuitively, private networking is a non-network effect business. Like if my business runs fiber and your business runs fiber, there's no sharing of resources. There's no network effect that comes from that. But if DoubleZero allows you to carve out, let's say, 10% of the fiber network that you've run and say, we're going to contribute this to DoubleZero protocol. We're going to get rewarded with token incentives, all those good crypto incentives we know and love. It can help offset the cost of unused capacity in your network, but it can also create now suddenly a more decentralized and distributed base layer infrastructure of connectivity than you get over these tier one ISPs. And so, in our initial sort of build out of this, we're working with 3 or 4 different contributors, but, an individual contributor company, for example, I don't remember exactly where Helios runs a bunch of nodes, but, if there was not a DoubleZero endpoint in that data center that you guys operate in, you can go out, you can take a lease on a piece of fiber, and you can bring DoubleZero into the place that you're already operating in. So it has all these good characteristics of a DPIN network. We don't call it DPIN because DPIN's confusing, because DPIN's usually a quality trade-off for coverage, and we're actually the opposite. We're a coverage trade-off for quality. But that's the basic way that these systems can run. And at that point, you get something you don't get with the public internet. Right? You have no guarantees of the route your packet takes on the public internet. Even if you're buying from like a top tier provider, you don't actually know that their switches aren't just holding your packets back for a quarter of a second to try and front run you. The likelihood of that's very low, but with DoubleZero, you will know with absolute certainty, this is the path my packet took. And if anyone is interfering along the line, the network is able to catch those types of things. And so we think we can bring more assurance and more transparency to how data moves throughout the internet. And we can also do it in a way that increases decentralization and increases the sort of certainty around the network level. Because right now in blockchain today, there's no network. None of the blockchains that exist today offer any certainty around networking.
So, Austin, I want to ask you about the fiber supply, because like you said, as a mental heuristic, this can roughly be thought of like a DPIN network. And for DPIN networks that require you to offer some kind of, tangible infrastructure like fiber, it can be difficult to find supply. Like the demand is easy, I guess, with the token, but just how much fiber is there in the world? Because I think this was an interesting piece of the white paper. And then B, how are you going to get that fiber to actually want to join your network and receive the DoubleZero token reward or whatever it'll be?
Yeah, so there's 2 classes of sort of fiber that we think about. One is terrestrial and the other is subsea. Terrestrial fiber is a massively underutilized asset. Up to 60% of the fiber in the United States is not actually lit, it's not actually carrying data at this point. That number tracks well for Europe as well, where they actually have very open access carrier laws that are super interesting. So basically the government runs a bunch of fiber and then anyone can take leases on them. So in Europe, when we've been talking with groups like Rockaway about building out some of the European connectivity, they're talking about like $500 a month for like 10 gig of wavelength service in Europe. It's incredibly cheap when you really think about that. Compared to the United States, those numbers are a bit higher. Subsea cables are different, right? Subsea cables are very carefully planned. They're very high OpEx operations. And they're very high CapEx as well. And so that means there's less spare capacity when it comes to the subsea cable systems. But those are actually the areas where a lot of like existing companies have leases on these types of fiber. And so if you look at like a trading firm, for example, they will usually buy in what's called full wavelength, which is so quick primer, fiber optics. They're glass, right? At the end of the day, it's a shard of glass. And through that piece of glass, you can pump different wavelengths of light, and those different wavelengths of light carry data. The way this works is actually fascinating because you need boosters periodically to basically boost the signal up. Those boosters are not in line. It's incredibly cool. They're basically clamped around the fiber and they've doped the fiber. And when the electrons and photons move through those pieces of glass, they jump up to an energy state because they're passing through a magnetic coil, and then they jump back down and decay at the right wavelength. So it's a zero latency booster. It's like the coolest thing in the world. It's basically the same way like night vision goggles work, but like as a side note, it's very cool technology that folks have figured out how to build for this stuff. But these HFT firms, they always buy in full wavelength because it has the least amount of latency introduced in the process. But they're overbuying capacity, right? Plenty of people have gone out, or plenty of companies have bought fiber, and they've overbought capacity to meet whatever other characteristics they need. And what's nice about this with DoubleZero is we don't need the latest and greatest. Even fiber from 10 or 15 years ago, in many markets, is a tenfold increase on the performance we can get over the public internet. And again, like it's weird to say this, but like the aspirations of blockchain are still fairly small. Like Solana's pushing, a goal of 1 million transactions per second. That's still actually not that much data in the world of fiber. That's maybe 2.5 to 3 gigabits per second of data, just in pure blocks, not in transactions and RPCs and all that stuff. But from that perspective, that's not actually that much data, right? We can go out and build a global, well, we have already a 20 gigabit global network contributed through this process. And that is going to be sufficient for a lot of the initial build out. It's pretty easy to see that upgrading to 100 and 400 over time as well. And so, bandwidth has this really nice property of the fiber that was laid 25 years ago is still usable today. It's not like CPUs where like you got to upgrade your validator every 2 years or like the CPU is too slow. Fiber doesn't have that property at all. And so we can use a lot of like the tier 2 and tier 3 fiber, and it's perfect for this type of application.
So just to like underscore there's no fiber that needs to be created. Like this sort of network can work in your view just with the fiber that exists in the world right now based on unused capacity for companies that overinstalled and things like this.
Oh, certainly. And that a lot of that's again because the ambition of blockchain is still just quite small, right? Until we get 4 or 5 networks that are all trying to push 10 million transactions per second or more, the needs of today can be met by the supply of today. And if we fast forward into the future, if this protocol is worth sufficiently large amounts of money someday, there's a foundation which, so my role as one of the co-founders is I'm running the foundation side. The other 2 co-founders are on the lab side, Matteo Ward and Andrew McConnell. The part of the deployment of the DoubleZero treasury at some point maybe joining cable consortiums that are actually laying new fiber and getting guaranteed dedicated space on those subsea cables. It might be satellite networks, right? We're thinking about spinning up a neutrino research lab at some point. There's a lot of like future tech that goes into this, and a lot of areas where like people forget that like Facebook literally wired up the entire Philippines with subsea cables so they could sell ads to people there. Like at some point, all sufficiently large enough software companies have to start looking at hardware, or else they realize their ambitions simply cannot be met. And we're trying to accelerate that process by a decade for the blockchain industry.
Talking about hardware, let's get to the slightly nerdier aspect, which is the FPGAs.
I thought we were already there.
One of the, so my mental model of DoubleZero, and it could be wrong, but that's okay, I'm wrong all the time, is one, better networking layer, better routing, higher bandwidth, more predictable latency, things like this. But also, perhaps a more interesting thing, or just as interesting, is the fact that you can do operations on the edge with specialized hardware devices, from what I understand. So things like signature verification or deduplication with a DoubleZero FPGA on some of these servers. Can you, and I'm sure I butchered that, can you talk a bit about how that works?
Yeah. So one of the core ideas here is if you can't throw hardware at the problem, you haven't solved scaling, right? This is like an old Tollyism of like, just give me more cores and give me more RAM and like Solana can go faster. And you can optimize all you want in software, and that's a good thing to do in parallel. But at the end of the day, like if you throw 256 cores and a terabyte of RAM at Solana, it should be able to go 4 times faster than it could with a fourth of those resources. And so DoubleZero, our first principle is throw more bandwidth and throw less latency at the problem, right? And that's always going to be like a main scaling model for it. But one of the pieces that we realize as we're looking at the transaction flow of data through a validator is you've got this entire army of 1,600 validators around the world, plus all of the, I think it's 2,000 plus RPCs operating as well nowadays. There's no resource sharing in any of that. The minute you are a block builder, you receive the full force of every inbound transaction coming at you through the internet. Even if it's coming through stake-weighted QoS connections or Jito bundles, you are still receiving a huge inbound flood of requests. And the validator spends about 70% of its time just sorting through transactions with invalid signatures, duplicate transactions, all this other kind of crap to get to the stuff it actually wants to put into the block. Well, it turns out those are pretty predictable operations, right? Signature verification is just 825519 math. Like, that is not something that requires a lot of variance from one operation to another. And so this is a perfect application for FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays. And what we can do is the switching hardware we're using, I mean, it's a 2U switch, so 2 rack unit switch, and you have DoubleZero coming into that via fiber connections, and you have, validators connecting into that switch, and one of these would go in basically every data center in every metropolitan area that you want to run nodes in. There's 2 big Xilinx FPGAs in that, again, fairly off the shelf. They're basically C1100s. And within those FPGAs, we can build images that do signature verification, that do transaction deduplication, that actually can implement transaction signing, can do all sorts of different types of operations accelerated. I wouldn't quite call it in hardware, because FPGAs are like, it's debatable how much is hardware and how much is software, but basically in hardware. And this is not the full performance you get out of like a Bitcoin ASIC miner, but these types of things are, it's interesting when you're talking about FPGAs because they're not, strictly speaking, faster than a CPU, but what they can do is they can pass data through much more quickly. And so these FPGAs can do signature verification and deduplication of about 1 million transactions per second coming in through them, and they can do that with functionally 0 latency. And a computer just simply can't do this the way it operates. Even the FireDancer client can't chew through this with anywhere near the latency and performance of something like an FPGA. And so what that means is downstream on the validator side, they're getting a clean stream of transactions that have already been verified, that have already been deduped. And the validators will, of course, do redundant signature verification on those transactions. But it reduces this giant fire hose of garbage being thrown at them from, pump.fun spanners and, guys who want to mint NFTs and arbitrage events that have huge amount of competition. And it's just one more defense layer for these type of networks. And so when you start to say, okay, we're taking 70% of the time away from a validator, we're giving it back 70% of its time, what can it do? It can pack blocks more efficiently. It can look at different types of, arbitrage events, maybe decentralized exchanges through something like Paladin. There's all sorts of different types of opportunities that a validator has. It doesn't have to sort through all of this garbage. It also reduces the bandwidth required significantly because we're filtering out all of this stuff before it gets to the validator.
So, having covered a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts of how this thing works, because I think a lot of people are very interested in that, I'm also just curious, like, what's the origin story here? I thought that was a fascinating tidbit that you said that the FireDancer demo at Breakpoint was actually DoubleZero, but nobody knew it at the time. So
Yeah.
clearly you've been working on this for a little bit of time, but where did the idea come from? How did it come together? Just, walk me through the DoubleZero kind of story so far.
Yeah, so Matteo, one of our co-founders, actually had the idea back in like 2016 into 2018. He started off working for Global Crossing back in the late 90s, which is the first company that ran all of the fiber lines for subsea cables around the world. He worked in the HFT space and did sort of the fiber to microwave to now shortwave transition there, and building out sites and kind of working on a lot of the carrier relationships and business work that was needed to build that stuff out. And he sort of had this idea that, like, why are blockchains communicating over the public internet? This doesn't make any sense. Also, if you go on like Solana Beach or validators.app or the Jito map, you see like the leaders just bouncing around the world constantly. And from a networking topology standpoint, this is crazy, right? You're introducing so much variance, so much latency, so much jitter. And so he had this idea back then of like, could we build a high performance channel for high performance blockchain data? And the answer was like, there weren't any fast blockchains back then. Ethereum was doing 17 to 21 things per second. Bitcoin was doing 7. And that was the landscape back then, right? And so there was really no need for it. fast forward to some of the learnings at the Firedancer project, and some of the engineers on Firedancer who'd worked with Matteo before sort of called him back up and were like, "Hey, remember that thing you were thinking about? Like, we want to talk. Like, I think the time maybe has come for something like this to make more sense." And so he and Andrew kind of reconnected and got this process going. And they started working on this probably about in January. And then I got involved in the project in sort of like mid to late spring, and it's kind of just been off to the races from there. We have a testnet up and running now that's connected into 16 cities globally. There's 4 Solana mainnet validators that are actually running on DoubleZero today. In a testnet capacity, so they're running validating mainnet blocks. 2 are running Frankendancer, 2 are running Agave. We're getting a bunch of great data from them, and looking to sort of start onboarding some folks in the January timeline.
Like Helios.
Like
Hopefully.
Helios, yeah, absolutely. Like, this is one thing I think people sort of like, they think about how DoubleZero is going to work, and they're like, okay, I get the use for validators, but like, there's not that many validators out there. At the end of the day, like, I think the real use case for this thing is state propagation, right? State propagation is necessary for consensus, but it's very much necessary for RPCs as well. So we think if we have, validators located on this network, RPCs located on this network, searchers, Jido block engine, indexers, all these types of systems, they can operate connected into DoubleZero. And we haven't even talked about multicast yet, which is one of the main advantages and systems that come with when you're building a homogeneous network like this.
Let's talk about it. Explain what it is for the audience and what to think of it.
Yeah, so the easiest way to explain multicast is actually to start with like Sonos speakers or AirPlay. So if you have like multiple Sonos speakers in your house or multiple AirPlay endpoints, and you want to play a song from Tidal or Spotify or something like that, or Audius, let's use some hometown teams. Each speaker is not going out and pulling in its own feed of data. Your phone is not sending out 12 different streams of data to get to all the Sonos speakers in your house. What's happening is your phone or the internet is sending that packet out once, and at the network layer, your router is basically cloning that data and sending it out to all the different endpoints it should get to. And this technology is called multicast as opposed to unicast. Unicast is one point to one point. Multicast is one point to many points. And this is the way that like HFT firms move pricing and order data around, right? So when there's a new price for, let's say, Tesla stock coming off the New York Stock Exchange, that's sent out via a multicast feed to all the different markets they're trading in and all their different trading systems. And so instead of one server having to send data to you, data to you, data to you, data to you, it just sends one packet, and the switch in the network level actually handles that data replication out from there. If you're familiar with Solana, this might sound a little bit like Turbine, right? So Turbine, the way it does is one validator sends packets to 4 validators, which send it to 4, which send it to 4, which send it to 4. And that process gets state transitions moved all around the network. And on the public internet, it's actually surprisingly efficient. It's the best anyone has done for state propagation on the public internet. But we can do way better using multicast, because suddenly the validators don't need all this bandwidth. They have to think about, how do I forward these packets on? Who do I forward these packets on? It's all taken care of on the network level. It also dramatically reduces the amount of bandwidth necessary in all of these types of systems as well, because a validator suddenly does not need to send all this traffic. It's handled by the switches on a hardware accelerated level across the network. And so we can do this for state transition. So if my validator is building a block and it has said, here's my proposed block, let me send it out, or each shred basically, but each shred gets sent out. I am now sending that shred once, and all of Mert's RPCs are pulling it in. All other validators on the network are automatically getting that data pushed to them. And so my validator doesn't have to spend all this time sending out data. Additionally, things like Jido's shred stream system that they've built, which is a system that bypasses Turbine because Turbine is stake weight deterministic. Those systems don't necessarily have to exist in the way they do today, because there's now no advantage in you don't get the packets any more quickly because you have a bunch of stake. It basically evens the playing field for receiving data about state transitions because everything is on the same multicast feed.
So I'm sure you have, and we've talked about the tech side of this quite often, and I'm sure you have had a lot of investor interest, and so you've received this question and perhaps practiced it. Okay, we understand how the tech works. How does this work as a business? How will DoubleZero grow to 100x? What is the go-to-market?
Yeah, so there's a few different components of this. So at its core, we can't make Solana faster than the protocol limits allow it to be. Right. That is just like a hard fact right now that like there's been a proposal. I forget the SIMD number about raising the CU limits by about 4% from 48 million up to 50 million. We think that through stuff like DoubleZero, we can basically give the cabal, I think is the technical term, the GitHub SIMD cabal, greater freedom to feel comfortable pushing those bandwidth limits and those compute limits higher because they know the base layer network can actually handle that. At its core, like our go-to-market is to tell validators the truth, which is, hey, if you operate on DoubleZero, you're going to be more profitable and your validator is going to be able to do more than it currently does today. For RPCs, I think it's a pretty easy sell as well because you'll be able to deliver transactions more quickly and more efficiently to the leaders. The great folks at Jito are already working on client optimization specifically for DoubleZero. And, we see validators moving for 10 basis points of additional NEV. I think they're going to be very willing to move or at least bring DoubleZero into the data centers that they're operating in based on the additional profitability that'll come from this. So this is, it's sort of like the killer feature in blockchain is product market fit. Helios has that. I think DoubleZero is going to have that from day one as well, just based on the excitement and demand we've seen for folks to operate on this thing. And, we're nailing Solana as our P1 target. But as I said at the beginning, this is not a Solana project, right? Solana Foundation doesn't hold any equity, doesn't have any tokens in this thing. This is just a project that is built to accelerate the aggregate performance of all validator networks all around the world. And we're starting with Solana because it's the hardest problem and it's the one where the demand is absolutely there today. But the goal over time is to support all fast blockchains and actually expand past just blockchain into other types of use cases as well.
Yeah, maybe going deeper on that business aspect as well. I'm curious how you foresee the tokenomics of all this working out.
Yeah.
So you've alluded to some kind of token reward involved with participating in the DoubleZero network. And then would validators kind of pay you in fiat based on a subscription model for the service you're providing? Or what, like, just how is money moving around with this?
Totally. So let's start on the validator side because that's actually the more complicated one. So validators will divert a percentage of their earnings to a DoubleZero address. Let's say it's 1% of earnings. It's a fairly low base fee to be involved in this, but obviously if you are the Coinbase validator, you're going to be paying more in real world dollar value, but you also have more stake and you have more traffic usage. These things track fairly linearly. Those, and I'll get into some of like the nitty gritty DeFi details here because this is like the audience for it. Normally we just sort of hand wave a little bit of this, but effectively what will happen is all those collected fees will go into a basket and that basket will be put up for auction once an epoch. And the reason we put it up for auction is to prevent a bunch of MEV bleed on this thing. But it will say, hey, we have, 2,000 SOL that are in this basket that have been paid in fees or 2,000 SUI tokens or Aptos tokens or whatever. Who wants to buy them? Right. And then suddenly you get an offer for that. And then that's denominated in DoubleZero tokens. And then all of those tokens are burned. Right. 50% of those burned tokens are then reminted to bandwidth contributors as rewards. So it has the same sort of economics of Solana where effectively 50% of transaction fees are burned. The reason we're doing this slightly complicated thing is we've seen even like L2 teams forget to top up their sequencer balance sometimes in ETH. And we really don't want to kick off a validator from the DoubleZero network simply because they forgot to top up their balance of DoubleZero tokens. For folks like Mert and RPCs, like they're just going to pay seat fees in DoubleZero tokens because they're much more professional operators. They can manage a balance, all those types of things. But we think it's really important that for validators to participate, they don't have anything additional to manage than they already have to do. They've got a big enough job already with keeping validators up and working on, all these different types of changes and relationships they want to build out. They shouldn't have to worry about topping up a balance of DoubleZero tokens as well. And then on the contributor side, people who provide bandwidth, they'll be able to stake tokens to their bandwidth links, right? Like our analogy here is like, there's no like DoubleZero validator, right? In the traditional sense, we're not building blocks. We're not doing these types of activities. So instead you can say, I'm coming in and providing a graph of bandwidth and I can stake tokens to that whole graph of bandwidth, basically one public key akin to sort of a stake pool method here, or you can stake to one individual bandwidth link. If you're someone like Brian Long and you're saying, I want to run in Denver and I want to bring bandwidth in, they could stake tokens just to that link that they're providing. And so they'll receive two things for that. One are sort of block builder rewards in quotes, which are basically just rewards for data passed over the line. And the second is participatory rewards, which are basically staking inflation, for lack of a better term. We think in a mature state, about 80% of the protocol revenue, as much as I hate that term, will come from priority fees, not base fees. We intend this to be similar to Solana in that the base fee to operate on the network is quite low, and prioritization is where most of the fee generation actually comes from.
And that would presumably go to DoubleZero because you can get people to get transactions included in the network faster than anyone else, is the idea?
Absolutely, yes. That the normal incentives to say, oh, we're just going to put a server right next to the Binance API ingest point, can't do that in blockchain, right? There's 1,600 validators all around the world. And yes, there's some co-location nowadays around, some Geo block engines. But part of our goal also is that we can actually expand the geographic circle of where it's possible to run validators because we're going to make the time less. So for example, it's very hard to run nodes in South America right now. From a latency standpoint, the public internet infrastructure down there is not very good. And so you hit a massive time penalty if you're trying to run validators in South America. Through DoubleZero, we can bring in dedicated lines or these folks who want to run validators in, let's say, Brazil or even Argentina can bring in dedicated bandwidth, and they're actually able to run validators there now. And so, we think we can basically expand. The protocols will have two options, right? This is not us dictating anything. They can either say, great, now we can run 200 millisecond block times, or we can keep 400 millisecond block times. And suddenly that sort of cone of where you can economically viably run validators expands dramatically.
So Austin, what is next for you guys? And what I mean by that is I'm sure you're hiring. What are you hiring for people watching this that might be interested? Give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, so DoubleZero.xyz has the white paper, has the jobs board, has a contact us. Malbec Labs is hiring for a whole bunch of different roles. I will say right now we are hiring almost exclusively senior people. Just like senior engineers. There's smart contract roles open for senior smart contract engineers. We're always interested in talking with network engineers who have experience in sort of this space, especially from like HFT firms and those sorts of areas. On my side of the foundation, we are hiring for a head of marketing. We're hiring for a head of network relations. We're starting to search for basically a DevRel person as well as a chief of staff. So there's there's also a fun little, like create your own role type situation. I have found some of the best hiring people, the best candidates come just in and they say, here's the pitch of what I want to do at the protocol. I will say we do require candidates to not necessarily know a ton about blockchain or networking, but be technically minded and be curious about this type of stuff. I would say this is much more akin to a project like Jito than it is a project like Drip House.
Correct. Well, we've talked quite a bit about DoubleZero. Very interesting. And something I still need to get on the testnet for, Austin.
We'll get you
And
hooked up.
I want to shift gears for this last section and talk about what this means for Solana Foundation. So you are heading out, and I would say this is quite good, healthy for a foundation to start dispersing talent to new ventures. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to be at Solana Foundation for another like 4 years, honestly. It is the place that I have felt most at home anywhere in blockchain. And there's a lot of, I guess I would say there's a lot of like the ambition in blockchain is still really small, which I think is something that like is surprising because we're all talking about like Bitcoin at 100K, Solana trying to get to 1 million transactions per second. But like in the grand scheme of things, I think the pace of innovation in this industry has slowed down. And it doesn't slow down on the application layer. There's incredible cool stuff getting built on the application layer. But like the base infrastructure layer, the aspirations are just pretty small. People are celebrating L2s that are pushing 200 transactions per second, or celebrating Solana operating at 7,000 transactions per second. Like these are rookie numbers still. And so when I looked around, what I saw was that the work I was doing at Solana Foundation was really fulfilling. It felt really good to me, but it wasn't necessarily the place I could make the most of a difference on this industry. And like I got into this network and this whole industry not to make money, but because I genuinely believe in the future of this technology. I believe in the social mission of this technology to sort of put people back in the driver's seat, to sort of break our custodial relationship with corporations, governments, the idea of like, oh, won't someone do something about this problem? It's like, yeah, man, you like go out and do it. Like that sort of ownership mindset is something I think we're missing in society, in part because of every piece of infrastructure we use today is built that if there's a problem, someone else will take care of it for you, right? Your debit card, like, I just throw my credit card number into anywhere on the internet because the bank will just like cover it, right? That whole sort of mentality, I think, has been really corrosive to society. And so we've seen this happen to the internet too, right? At the end of the day, like if we have the big cloud providers running everything on the internet, that's not really an internet we're going to want to operate in. And so I think this is probably the highest value thing I can be doing to advance Solana, to advance the industry in general, and to further, blockchain globally. And the question is sort of like, oh, why not? Like, there's two questions I've been getting from this. Why not launch a protocol on Solana, like something on Solana just for Solana? And the other one is, why not just sort of stay at Solana Foundation? And I think with both of them, it's that the aspirations are bigger, and I think there's a lot of good work to be done. The other thing too is like, I don't think Solana Foundation is terribly important anymore. I think it's on its maybe the end result will be a bit better, but it's on its Ethereum Foundation arc, right? It used to be one of the most important players, and now fundamentally, like Anza is an independent team, Firedancer is an independent team, Jito is an independent team, Helios is an independent team. There's a lot of real engineering firepower and narrative firepower and sort of technology mindset that's not coming from the foundation anymore. It is a really important role to play in grant giving and funding of sort of moonshot style initiatives. But also, like, DoubleZero is a moonshot initiative that does not need any funding from the Solana Foundation, right? The economics of this network and this industry have evolved to the point where we can go out and raise a boatload of money and try and disrupt the fundamental infrastructure of the internet. And like that doesn't require a big subsidy from the Solana Foundation the same way building an open source validator client does. And so I think it's good that folks are starting to move on. I think there is something about sort of that 4-year timeline that feels like by that point, you've like definitely hit the 80-20 curve of what you can learn. And the other thing too is like Raj and Toli have set up those organizations. Granted, like Raj is, he's on the board of the foundation. Toli's not really involved in the foundation, but they've set these organizations up to be pretty much the best training wheels you could ever want for people who might want to go and be a founder someday. And so, from that perspective, it's like there's no better training I could have asked for than the last 4 years working in the Solana ecosystem.
Yeah. So, you're in the grand scheme of things, a longer tenured employee at the foundation and at Solana Labs, having been there nearly 4 years, as you said. So,
Yeah.
and you, I think, started in sort of a marketing role, and you ended up as head of strategy. So, just over that journey, what are you most proud of, or what do you think is the most important work you did in your time at Labs and the foundation?
That's a good question. So I'll give the caveat here of like it takes a village, and apart from totally having his two coffee and a beers moment and coming up with proof of history, um, nothing is ever done by one person, especially at a organization that is so dedicated to open source contributions. Like there have been so many times where things I've been working on have been made better by someone else just kind of drive-bying, saying, "Oh, what about this way?" And ways I've done the same type of thing for others. So it really does take a village to build this thing, and I think the great man theory of history is like directionally right, but it's wrong on execution all the time. Like Gwen Shotwell is the person that built SpaceX into what it is today, right? And she's as much responsible for that as Elon is, and neither one of them would have been able to do it without each other. So with that caveat and disclaimer, I think that the one of the things I'm most proud of at the Solana Foundation is that we stayed true to our scrappy core and vision. Like one of the things that's made Solana Foundation so powerful and made the network so strong is that this insistence on building things at the lowest level possible. To say when something like Metaplex is getting spun up, there's this whole theory about how the thing's going to work, but at its core, we got to build these things in modules that people can rip apart. And the entire thesis of Metaplex was completely wrong, except that people wanted NFTs. And so token metadata became the way people created NFTs, but everything else about the thesis was totally wrong. Stake pools kind of operated in a little bit of the same way. So I think I've been able to sort of keep us focused on very low level technology and to be focused on building things in ways that are saying, well, what our goal is to expand the capacity at the base layer and let entrepreneurs smarter than us come in and build better products and services on top of it. No one at the foundation ever would have come up with pump.fun, right? But it wasn't our job to come up with pump.fun. It was our job to make sure there's a network where you could build something like that if you wanted to. And so I think the other piece too is not getting into the grant chasing, not getting into the place of trying to buy large Web2 enterprises that want to come over and want to build something. But in reality, they're looking for a large payout in order to sort of send a press release. We did a pretty great job of steering away from that. And a lot of that came down to some of the DNA that Raj and Toli have put into the organization, but that was not a consensus bet by any means to turn down a lot of these big grants that a lot of other networks were paying, and I don't think we've seen much come from those in retrospect. And it was a pretty big drain on some of those organizations' treasuries, and so I think one of the really important parts of non-founder level long-term employees is keeping institutional memory and having the credibility to infuse that into an organization that sometimes is hard for founders to do, because it's very easy to dismiss the views of founders as like being a founder is like there's something a little wrong with you if you're going to be a founder, right? Like it is pretty, you need a lot of bravado to say, I think there's room for my idea to change the world. That is not like a normal human response. And so you always need the people who are playing checks and balances on founders and are calling them on bullshit and have the credibility within the organization to sort of push back when you need the pushback, but also like rally the troops when people are like, well, of course the founder is going to say this. They're delusional because it's their company. I think I'm sure, Mert, you've had similar experiences in going out and saying, look, every other blockchain infrastructure company in the world raised a down round in 2022. We're going to go launch an infrastructure company and be worth, $1 billion someday. Like that's a pretty ballsy thing to do. And it was definitely not a high conviction bet at the time, but it's obviously played out. But that's sort of like the founder DNA. There's always something a little wrong with us. And I think that's always important to like keep in mind.
Yeah, I was laughed out multiple times for doubling down on Solana when it had 3-digit developer population and
75 devs.
Yeah, no one's laughing anymore. Well, Austin, we will have you back on next year, But until then, what is the number one thing you want to accomplish by the time you come back on this podcast?
Oh, well, we definitely need testnet up and running. I think, look, we are trying to speed run this as much as possible. My goal is that we have validators permissionlessly able to run on DoubleZero, paying in tokens and that whole token functionality by breakpoint 2025. I think it's within shot for us. I think permissionless bandwidth contribution will take a little bit longer because there's the orchestration systems there are quite complicated. But I think if we don't have the network live by breakpoint, we've probably done something wrong. So I don't know. Let's say Solana's running at 1 million TPS by January 2027.
All right. Book it January 2027. Throwing some time on your calendar, Austin. We'll have you back on the show. But look, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really fun to get to hear about DoubleZero. I think it was a pretty compelling project and white paper when it came out last week. And hopefully listeners get as much out of it as I did. And best of luck to you as you go ahead and build that out.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Great. Take care.